This is Bosworth battlefield, and it was here all those years ago that Richard III lost his life. In this video we are going to be looking at the medical evidence of how he died, having a stab, pun intended, at who killed him, and looking at Shakespeare's portrayal of Richard III and seeing, was Shakespeare a complete punk? Richard III was the last king of England to die in battle, and he died somewhere right here. It's incredible. Let's meet Richard III through Shakespeare's eyes. Now, Richard III through Shakespeare's eyes is the ultimate villain, twisted in body and twisted in soul. Shakespeare, you cannot separate the twistedness of his physical being from the evil of his personality. Now, Shakespeare would have us believe that Richard III was an evil hunchback. In Act 1, Scene 1, Shakespeare has Richard III say this: "Deformed, unfinished, sent before my time, into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt them." Shakespeare's portrayal of Richard from a literary perspective is masterful. He is cunning but charismatic, and his evil draws you in. Richard III is also beautifully presented by Laurence Olivier, and his Richard III is a bent evil hunchback. But how much is this the reality? Let's look at the medical evidence. Now, let's talk about Richard III's back, okay? So, if you listen to Shakespeare, he had a shoulder that was higher than another one. He's very hunched over. If you look at Laurence Olivier's portrayal of him, it's very kind of evil hunchback. The likelihood is, now that we have Richard's body, you can see that his spine does have what is a very pronounced curvature called a scoliosis. Now, he likely had an adolescent scoliosis, so what that means is that he was completely straight-backed until, well, not straight-backed, no one has a straight back, you have natural curvatures in your spine, but he had no problems until he was perhaps 10, 11, 12, and then as he grew, the scoliosis would have grown in. Now, it likely would have made him a little bit shorter than the average person. I think he came in at about 5'8", but would have looked a little bit shorter than that. Now, his shoulders one of them would have been slightly higher, but a good tailor might well have been able to cover that. And he would have had his exercise tolerance, because obviously if you're very hunched, it can affect your ability to breathe, which can affect your ability to run and do things like that. Don't think that Richard's would have been massively compromised. So if you think about Shakespeare's portrayal, Laurence Olivier's portrayal, I think that's really not accurate to how Richard III looked and walked around. He would, like any of us, have had a minor something about himself which kind of marked him out, but which of us don't have any physical flaws? I know that I do. It was just too easy for Shakespeare to take those small flaws and amplify them. Now, before we get into the slicing and the medical history of what happened to Richard's body, we need to think about the political intrigues of what's going on in the War of the Roses, because otherwise you kind of can't understand where Shakespeare's coming from when he writes Richard III. So when you have Edward III, this is the Plantagenet family, he's King of England, and his offspring basically splits the family into two branches. There's the White Rose of York and the Red Rose, and that is going down John of Gaunt's line, and they are the ones that's going to be king. We get to Henry VI, and we don't know what's going on with Henry VIII. I'll have a look into it, guys, and I'll make a video about it. I don't know at the moment, okay? He had some sort of mental disorder. It was either bipolar or dementia, but basically, at the time, contemporary reports, they all think he's mad. And so what you get is tension between these two branches of this very bloodthirsty Plantagenet family. Now, this is a hill I will die on. George Martin, when he wrote Game of Thrones, based all of that on this. I might make a video about it, because honestly, I think Elizabeth Woodville is Cersei Lannister, and I can go off on a whole we're not going to go down there now. But anyway, Henry VI something is wrong with him. People think that he couldn't and shouldn't be king. So Richard, Duke of York, kind of rises up and he gets killed, and he leaves behind three sons: Edward, who is the eldest, George of Clarence, who has a very interesting death, and Richard, who will be the topic of this video, Richard III. Okay? Now, it's not as straightforward as to say they challenge the Lancastrian side and they win, because there is a bit of back and forward. It does take years. They do lose the throne. But effectively, they do win, and Edward IV becomes king. Now, his brother George of Clarence, he kind of rebels and is forgiven and rebels and forgiven. Eventually they decide to kill him and they drown him in a vat of Malmsey wine. You heard that correct. Anyway, so now you only have 2 siblings left. You've got Edward IV and you've got Richard. Now, as a side note, it's really interesting. Both of these men are noted in contemporary reports to be handsome. Okay, I want you to think about this when you think about Richard, because Edward is this, you know, really handsome prince king. You know, he's very young. But they also say that about Richard. He's not as handsome as Edward, but he is handsome. Okay, so we live in a culture now at this point where you've got one family who has been killing each other for a while, and you've got Edward and Richard who have literally killed their own brother, George, okay? I want you to think about this when you think about Henry VIII. Okay, so Edward has 2 sons. These are the princes in the Tower. And then Edward, who doesn't make a very long life, sadly, things would have been very different if he had. He dies quite unexpectedly in his early 40s. Now, Richard should be Lord Protector, and he should be protecting these boys so that Edward can be king and Richard after him. But Richard doesn't do this, and this is one of the reasons why I'm not in the camp of Richard III has been framed. He wasn't a complete villain. I think he was a bit of a villain. You can argue that perhaps, so the princes end up in the Tower. He never meant that they got killed, fine. But actually he does more than that. We know that he moves against everyone in his inner circle, his historic allies who are very supportive of the princes. The Prince's uncle Anthony, he takes him out, he gets executed, he executed his own chamberlain. I think Richard knows exactly what he's doing. He's making a power play. Now, obviously, we get Henry Tudor, who is coming from the red side, who is coming from the Red Roses. He's a Lancastrian, and eventually he will challenge Richard on the Battle of Bosworth, and we all know how this ends. Richard is killed. He is stripped naked, he is thrown over a horse, and he almost certainly receives humiliation injuries as he is paraded around for the next 2 days. Now, what Henry Tudor does, which is incredibly brilliant in a strategic sense, is he marries Edward's daughter, Elizabeth. Now, these are Henry VIII's parents. So what they do when they create the new Tudor dynasty is they unite the white and the red, which is why you get the Tudor roses red and white, because it's York and Lancaster. Now, when Shakespeare is writing this, he is writing this in the Elizabethan court. Now, when we look back at Henry's reign and we look back at Elizabeth's reign, it's easy for us to see that they're quite stable reigns. You know, we don't have all the chopping and changing of monarch like we do in the Wars of Roses. There were wars with France, and there was a lot of tension with Spain and with Scotland, but actually you don't have many kind of coups. But they didn't know that at the time. So it really makes sense for Henry VIII to know what he knows about his great uncles, everyone in his family. It is a brutal, absolutely brutal place to grow up and to live. Now, one of the things that both Henry and Elizabeth will have been hyper aware of is that they are not Plantagenets. So they come down the Plantagenet line, otherwise they wouldn't have any kind of credibility to be king or queen, okay? But they are not Plantagenets, they are Tudors, and everyone who's had a stronger claim by this point has basically been executed. But they are not the Plantagenet line. So Henry VIII does his best to kind of wipe out all of the last remaining Plantagenets. But it's going to be really important to create a smear, I guess, and it's no accident in this period that you're starting to get Tudor propaganda against Richard III. It suits Henry VIII, it suits Elizabeth to have those old Plantagenets, those bloodthirsty Plantagenets. It suits them to have his name smeared, because then no one is questioning their right to rule. If you are Elizabeth, you know, and you're only a generation down from all of this kind of craziness, you've got Scotland threatening to overthrow you. Do you really want people talking about how great those Plantagenets were? Because I'm sure they will find some heir from somewhere and bring and try and challenge for the throne. And this is the context in which Shakespeare is writing Richard III. It suits for everyone to malign him. And in the next section, we're going to be talking about how Richard makes it so easy to do that. Okay, we come to the injuries. Okay, so wounds 1 to 3. So what you're looking at here is basically a sharp bladed weapon has clipped the skull. Now, obviously, whenever we look at injuries like this that are on the skeleton, what we can see is we can only see images that are profound enough to have marked the bone. But you know in yourself, you are so much more than bone. We don't have any information on what his soft tissue injuries are. So actually his injuries might have been way more profound than this. And I think these are absolutely terrible injuries. So it's likely that these injuries 1 to 2 are a sharp bladed weapon like a sword. You can even see some small striations. Now, the scalp, the thing that strikes me as a doctor is that the scalp is incredibly vascular. So wound number 1, certainly that is going to bleed terribly, and that blood is, we don't know what the sequence is in terms of what order he got these injuries in, or if some of them might have happened after death, because there's just no way to tell that from these injuries if it happened very quickly after death. So wound number 3, that's a small penetrating wound, something like a dagger. We don't know how deep this penetrated. Now, had he walked away from the battle with just wounds 1, 2 and 3, I think he still would have died, because this is going to be a dirty penetration. It looks like it didn't penetrate super far because it's pushed the bone in. So you've got kind of the skull, the dagger goes in, and the shards of bone have kind of gone here. Had you had something that's gone in, it might well have separated those pieces of bone, and you might well have found them elsewhere, or if they've been missing. They're not missing. So the likelihood is it didn't go in very far. Now, we come to wounds 5 and 6, which are going to be fatal very quickly. So number 5 is the largest injury, and the base of the skull is completely sliced away. So this is going to be a very large, very sharp blade which has been wielded with a hell of a whack. And the forensic evidence is that this is consistent with something like a halberd, and I'll be showing you one of those. And when I say later we'll be having a stab at who killed him, we're going to need this piece of information. So an injury like this, immediately fatal, and I'm almost tempted to kind of give a summary of what happens in this injury, but these injuries are just so incredibly profound that he's going to die very quickly. So wound number 6, so this might well have been fatal on its own, either 5 or 6, and what you're getting is a very big jagged hole in the left lower side of the skull, and what you're getting is a sword or something similar that's being thrust through the bone, and that is going to penetrate to about, they think, the depth of about 10.5 centimeters, and it's so deep that the corresponding cut mark actually hits the atlas vertebrae, so that's kind of here where your neck is hinging. This is a catastrophic injury, and he has 2 of these, so the likelihood is he actually probably didn't suffer for very long. But the reality is he must have been surrounded. At some point he was thrown from his horse. What you have is you have a couple of wounds up here, and then you're getting the others which are kind of here, and either he was standing, his helmet must have come off, and the halberd comes from the back, and then he falls, and then someone from the front is able to chop with the sword. That seems the most likely thing to me. Someone came from behind. Otherwise, it's kind of difficult to imagine how he got all of these injuries. Now, number 7, he's also got a cut on the lower jaw. There's a hole in his right cheek. I find it really sad to read, because you can kind of, as you read through the injuries, you can kind of see that he was completely surrounded. It's like Julius Caesar, there's just blades everywhere. There's also number 9, there's a tool mark on the right mandible, there's a cut on the 10th rib. And then number 11, in some ways the saddest injury. I think likely this was done post-mortem, although we can't necessarily tell that from the forensic evidence in terms of wound healing. But if you look at the wound, it's most likely that someone has stabbed from behind, they've stabbed through his buttock, and actually it hits his pelvis. And we know from contemporary records that after his death he was stripped naked, he was like thrust over a horse, and I think what's happened is someone has, done the ultimate humiliation, which is to shove a dagger or a sword up through his bottom, and it's just a really sad, humiliating way of treating a human being. So who killed Richard III? It's impossible for us to definitively say, but some of the contemporary accounts suggest that a Welshman with a halberd, which is this weapon, were the ones who took the king down. Now, if we look at the remains of the king's body, the slices on the top of his head look like they have been done with a sword, but the penetrating fatal wounds on the underside of the skull were most likely done by a weapon like this. So was it that the contemporary record is correct and that a Welshman with a halberd was the one who killed King Richard? We'll never know, but it is interesting to think. So we come to the end of the video, and there's a lot for us to reflect upon, and it's great if you're still here, and I would love to know your thoughts. I don't think that Richard was an angel. I think he almost certainly killed the princes in the Tower. He certainly moved against them. But I don't think that Shakespeare's portrayal of him as this evil, crippled hunchback that, like we have seen, this archetype that comes from ancient Greece, which is incredibly harmful to disabled people even today. I don't think that's helpful. Was Shakespeare a punk? Maybe a bit. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you love the channel. Please do like, please do subscribe if you like more of these videos. I made a Charlotte Bronte one last week, which you should definitely check out. Thanks so much for watching. You guys, these are the shoes that I've worn to the battlefield. Keyword, field.